If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The camera opens on a wide stretch of barren land in northern Persia. The ground is dry, uneven, and scattered with loose stones that reflect the cold morning light. A single dirt road cuts through the landscape toward an Allied airstrip built between low hills. The wind carries dust that moves in thin sheets across the ground. Nothing feels stable or welcoming. Everything looks temporary, improvised, and strained. The Allied airstrip is a mix of American and Soviet presence. Trucks move slowly between fuel drums stacked against sandbags. Mechanics work beside open engine panels, their sleeves rolled up, their faces set in silent concentration. Soviet guards patrol the outer fence, rifles slung over their shoulders, keeping watch on the Americans as much as on the distant mountains. The cooperation between the two sides exists, but it is tight and easily disrupted. Inside this uneasy environment, Lieutenant Daniel Hart, 21, steps out of a tent with a thick folder under his arm. His uniform is clean, but still stiff from lack of washing. His posture is normally straight, but today it carries a slight tension. He stops for a moment to steady his breathing. He has been awake since dawn, unable to sleep. The reality of his first assigned mission sits heavily on his chest. Daniel walks across the base with a focused but anxious expression. He keeps his eyes down, not wanting the senior pilots to see how nervous he is. Their jokes from the night before still echo in his mind. Comments about rookies crashing on clear days and Persia eating inexperienced pilots alive. They meant it as humor, but Daniel internalized every word. He tries to push those thoughts aside by focusing on routine. Check the maps. Check the headings. Review the weather sheet. Memorize the altitudes. He repeats these steps silently in his head. It helps him keep his fear contained. Daniel's background follows him everywhere. He grew up in a house where silence meant survival. His father's temper often erupted without warning, and Daniel learned to stay quiet, hide mistakes, and avoid attention. His younger siblings looked up to him, relying on him to shield them. Leaving them behind for the army created guilt he cannot shake. War felt like an escape at first, but now, only 2 weeks at this base, he realizes it is simply a new kind of pressure. He reaches the briefing tent. Officers move around a large table covered in maps, marked with blue and red grease pencil lines. The air smells of fuel, dust, and the faint metal scent of engine oil carried in from outside. Across the room, working at a smaller desk with a typewriter and radio receiver, sits Elena Morozova, 24. She wears a Soviet uniform with slightly worn fabric around the elbows and collar. Her hair is tied back in a tight knot. Her movements are precise, controlled, and disciplined. Elena's task is to coordinate the shared air routes between Soviet and American flights. Her English is clear but measured. She chooses each word carefully so that no one misinterprets her. She keeps her focus on her maps and radio transmissions, rarely speaking unless someone directly asks her something. Most Americans treat her with distant politeness. They trust her enough to use her translations, but only because the command structure requires it. Her past is never spoken aloud, but the weight of it shapes her behavior. She once worked in a factory in Smolensk before the German invasion. Her family is gone, killed during the chaos of the city's fall. She has learned that the only way to maintain stability is by doing her job with precision and shutting down all displays of emotion. When she sits in silence, she is not detached. She is containing memories that she cannot afford to relive here. Daniel approaches her desk with a half-folded flight plan. He clears his throat, try to sound confident. Lieutenant Morozova, I need to confirm Corridor B for her. She looks up, studies him briefly, and gestures for him to place the map on the table. Her eyes move quickly across the coordinates. She speaks in a calm, low voice. You will follow this route. She taps the map with a pencil and maintain altitude within this range. Soviet patrols operate further east. Stay west of the ridgeline. Do not cross it. Her tone is strict, not unfriendly. She sees immediately that he is young and uncertain. His hands tremble slightly when he hands her his notes. Elena takes an extra moment to clarify the most important boundaries, drawing a small correction on his paper so he cannot miss it. She does this without emotion, but it is the closest thing to concern she allows herself. Daniel watches her work and feels two conflicting emotions: relief that she seems competent and fear that one mistake on his part could put him at risk. Or worse, make him look like a fool. "I won't cross it," he says, trying to sound sure of himself. Elena lifts her eyes again. She gives a short, careful nod, but says nothing more. She is not convinced, but she won't embarrass him by saying so. Daniel leaves the operations hut with his maps held tightly in both hands. The air outside is colder than before, the wind picking up small clouds of dust. He stops near his aircraft and studies the mountains in the distance. The ridge line looks far away, but he knows how quickly unfamiliar terrain can distort judgment. He feels a familiar discomfort growing in his stomach. His inner thoughts run together. Don't mess this up. Don't lose track. Don't give them a reason to regret sending you. A crew chief signals that the aircraft will be ready to take off soon. Daniel nods, still memorizing every coordinate he can. Back at the operations desk, Elena watches him from the doorway for a brief moment. She sees a young man carrying more pressure than he knows how to handle. She recognizes the expression because she has worn it herself many times. She turns away before he notices her. The chapter ends with Daniel standing alone beside his aircraft as mechanics finish last checks. He adjusts his gear, swallows his fear, and forces himself to breathe evenly. The cold wind moves across the runway. In the distance, a Soviet guard watches silently. Elena returns to her radio, waiting for the moment when his call sign will appear on her board. Both understand the mission differently. Daniel sees it as his first chance to prove he belongs here. Elena sees it as another fragile link in an alliance already strained by mistrust. Neither imagines how quickly everything will go wrong. Daniel climbed into the cockpit with careful movements, his leg muscles tight from the tension of the morning. The sun was just beginning to rise above the ridges, casting a pale, metallic light across the airstrip. He pulled the shoulder straps down, clicked them into place, and took a slow breath. His stomach felt tight, but he forced his hands to stay steady as he moved across the instrument panel. Every gauge, every switch, every heading had to be perfect. This was his first operational mission. Any mistake would confirm everything he feared about himself. The engine started with a rough growl, then steadied. Dust rose around the aircraft as it taxied toward the runway. Daniel kept his eyes forward, refusing to look at the small group of senior pilots who had stepped outside to watch. He felt their unspoken judgment, and it added an extra weight to his chest. He told himself again that this was simple reconnaissance, not a combat strike. He had flown harder maneuvers in training. But this time, the responsibility was real, and the consequences were not simulated. In the operations hut, Elena monitored the departure board while listening to overlapping messages coming through the radio. She wore her headset with one ear uncovered so she could hear the conversations around her. When Daniel's aircraft received clearance to take off, she leaned closer to the transmitter and noted his position on her grid. There was no formal reason for her to pay more attention to this pilot than to any other, but something about the tension in his voice during their earlier meeting stayed with her. Daniel rolled down the runway and lifted off. The airstrip shrank beneath him, and the base quickly became a cluster of small shapes surrounded by empty land. He leveled the plane, checked his compass, and adjusted his heading toward the assigned corridor. The flight started smoothly. The clear morning air made the ground features sharp and easy to read, and he began to relax as he recognized several terrain markers from his briefing. But the questions left hanging from Chapter 1, the fragile coordination between Allied units, the unclear trust between Elena and the Americans, and whether Daniel truly understood the boundaries he was to avoid, were now entering the center of the narrative. Daniel interpreted the ridge line exactly as drawn on his American map, unaware that the coordinates had been incorrectly adjusted during the translation process the night before. The boundary Elena warned him about existed on her Soviet charts, but not in the same spot on his. The misalignment was small on paper, yet significant in the field. 15 minutes into the flight, Daniel noticed a faint haze settling around the mountain peaks ahead. The light refracted in a way that made distances slightly deceptive. He corrected his angle by a few degrees, but not enough. In his head, he repeated the warnings he had been given. Stay west of the ridge. Do not drift toward the eastern passes. He believed he was doing exactly that. Back at the base, Elena received a brief coded message from a Soviet patrol station. The signal reported an unidentified aircraft approaching from the southwest at an unexpected altitude. She checked her board. Daniel's plane was near that sector, but according to his projected path, he should have still been outside the restricted zone. A small knot of worry formed in her stomach. She stepped closer to the map, tracing his intended route with her finger. Her instincts told her something was wrong, but without clear evidence, she could not declare an emergency. She took the safer option. She passed the message to the American liaison officer, urging him to confirm Daniel's position. The liaison dismissed her concern at first, muttering that rookies often flew slightly off course early in their careers. Elena did not react outwardly, but frustration tightened her jaw. She wrote the grid reference again and repeated her request. This time, the liaison hesitated and finally forwarded the inquiry to the tower. The delay was only a few minutes, but minutes mattered. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his path, now unknowingly drifting toward the Soviet deployment zone, where frontline units were positioned with strict defensive orders. From the ground, the men saw a plane flying low from a direction known for German reconnaissance attempts. They had no record of an Allied aircraft scheduled in that exact sky sector. The first anti-aircraft round detonated several hundred meters away, but close enough for Daniel to see the smoke burst. His heart jumped. For half a second, he froze in disbelief. His breathing turned sharp and uneven. Then more rounds erupted around him, closer, louder. Instinct took over. He pushed the throttle forward, trying to climb, but a burst ripped through the left wing. The plane lurched violently, and he felt the impact travel through his ribs. In the operations hut, the radio crackled with panicked fragments of Daniel's voice. Elena moved fast, grabbing the headset fully over both ears. She listened to the distortion, static, breath, broken words, but she recognized his tone. The liaison and tower operator shouted over each other. Only Elena kept her focus. She looked at the map and understood instantly. He had crossed into the wrong grid. Not by recklessness, by miscommunication. Daniel tried to keep altitude, but the aircraft was losing stability too quickly. Fuel lines hissed. Smoke filled one edge of the canopy. His eyes stung, and his hand shook. In those frantic seconds, he thought of his siblings, of the promise he made to write to them, and of how it would look if he died here on his first mission. He felt the crushing fear of disappointing them again. He searched the terrain for any open stretch where he might land. There was nothing flat or forgiving, only narrow ridges and sloping ground. Still, he committed to one possibility, a long strip of sand broken by rocks, but wide enough to give him a chance at a survivable crash. He shut off the fuel, braced his arms, and brought the aircraft down as controlled as his failing systems allowed. The landing was violent. The plane skidded, broke apart, and finally slammed to a stop beside a cluster of boulders. Daniel's vision blurred, his ears rang, and every breath felt like fire in his chest. But he was alive. At the base, soldiers ran back and forth, officers argued, and confusion spread. Some believed the Soviets had fired without warning. Others insisted the Americans had flown into forbidden space. The tension escalated instantly, each side ready to defend its version of events. Voices rose inside the operations hut, and translators struggled to keep up. Amid the shouting, a Soviet officer stepped toward Elena and gave her a direct order. She would go out into the field, locate the downed pilot, and negotiate safe passage. She was chosen not because anyone trusted her completely, but because she was the only Russian speaker with the discipline to control an already volatile situation. Elena nodded once. She made no complaint, no show of fear, but inside, she felt the gravity of the task. She understood that the wrong move could collapse the cooperation that held this base together. She also felt something she did not voice, a quiet, grudging concern for Daniel, the inexperienced young pilot who had looked at her earlier with so much pressure on his shoulders. She gathered a map, medical supplies, a field radio, and climbed into a Soviet truck. As it rolled away from the base and into the barren landscape, the weight of responsibility settled heavily on her. She did not know if the pilot was alive. She did not know if Soviet patrols were still searching for the intruder. She did not know if the Americans believed this was deliberate aggression. But she knew one thing with certainty. If she failed to find him and bring him back safely, the price would not be paid by a single soldier. It would be paid by everyone on that airstrip. And so the search began, quiet, tense, and with more at stake than anyone had intended when Daniel Hart lifted off an hour earlier. The truck carrying Elena pushed deeper into the barren land, its engine humming against the wide emptiness. The sky had begun to brighten into a pale, washed-out blue that gave no comfort. The driver kept both hands tightly on the wheel, his eyes shifting between the road and the distant ridges. Elena held a map on her lap, adjusting her pencil marks with each passing kilometer. She monitored the radio for any update, American or Soviet, but the frequency remained filled with static. The silence bothered her more than she admitted. It meant Daniel might not have been found by any patrol, friendly or otherwise. She reviewed everything in her mind: the misaligned coordinates, the late translation, the missing confirmation call, the confusion in the operations hut. These details had been left vague in earlier scenes. How exactly Daniel ended up in the wrong airspace, what the Soviet units had been told, and why neither side noticed the error until it was too late. Now, she pieced them together with a clarity that filled the empty spaces the audience would have wondered about. A small, simple mistake had spiraled because pressure, fatigue, and language barriers had left both sides careless. And now she was driving into hostile ground to clean up the consequences. After nearly an hour, a thin column of blackened metal caught Elena's eye. She leaned forward, pointing. "There," she said sharply. The driver slowed as they turned off the road. The ground became uneven, studded with rocks and hard patches of sand. When they crested a small rise, the wreck of Daniel's aircraft came into full view: broken wing, torn fuselage, scorch marks along the frame. The sight was harsh and quiet. There were no bodies, but no movement either. Elena stepped out of the truck before it fully stopped. The dry air hit her face, and she scanned the area with steady eyes. She wasn't afraid of debris or danger. She was afraid of finding nothing. No pilot, no sign, no clue. That would mean he had either wandered too far or been captured by an angry patrol, still believing he was an enemy intruder. She approached the wreck carefully, checking the ground for footprints or drag marks. Her voice stayed low, controlled. "Lieutenant Hart? Daniel Hart? If you hear me, answer." At first, there was only wind. Then, after several long seconds, she heard the crunch of shifting sand behind a broken section of wing. Daniel emerged slowly, leaning on a piece of twisted metal for support. His flight suit was torn, coated in dust, and darkened by blood on one leg. His face was pale, but he was conscious, his gaze fixed on Elena with disbelief and relief blended together. "You're Elena." From the operations hut, he managed, speaking through a tight jaw. "You're alive," she replied, keeping her voice steady, though a quiet wave of tension left her shoulders. "Can you walk?" "Barely." He took a step, stumbled, and Elena caught him by the arm. The contact made him flinch, not out of fear, but out of pain and embarrassment. He disliked needing help, especially from someone who had looked at him earlier with quiet skepticism. Elena did not comment. She supported him to the truck with practiced efficiency. The driver opened the back and helped Daniel climb in. Once he sat down, Elena examined his wound. The gash on his leg was deeper than she expected. His breathing grew uneven when she tightened the bandage. "How long were you conscious after the crash?" Elena asked. "I don't know. I woke up a few times. The engine was still smoking when I dragged myself out." His voice was strained, but he remained clear-headed. She saw that he was scared, not in a panicked way, but in the raw way someone feels after a close brush with death. It reminded her of factory workers she once knew who survived bombardments. Alert eyes, shallow breathing, quiet confusion that had not yet settled into full understanding. The truck headed back toward the main track. Elena stayed beside Daniel in the rear compartment, holding onto the edge of the bench as the vehicle jolted over uneven ground. Daniel tried to sit upright, but every bump sent pain through his leg and ribs. He grit his teeth, refusing to ask for anything. "You should lie back," she said. "I'm fine," he insisted. "You're not," Elena replied calmly, adjusting his position anyway. She did it gently but firmly, and he didn't resist a second time. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The tension of the earlier chapters, Daniel's embarrassment before senior pilots, his fear of failure, Elena's frustration with miscommunication, lingered between them. But survival forced a different tone here. Both needed the other. Elena finally broke the silence. "You crossed into the wrong zone." Daniel closed his eyes, ashamed but not defensive. "I know. I thought the ridge line was further east. My map. Your map was wrong." Her voice was steady and direct. "The coordinates from the Soviet notice were shifted one grid. Our own staff did not recheck them carefully enough. You did not ignore instructions." Daniel opened his eyes. "So it wasn't just me." "No," she answered. "It was many people, and now they're arguing about it instead of working." The admission hit him harder than the crash. He had carried the belief that he had ruined everything. Now he realized he had been caught in a system that was cracking under pressure. A sudden, violent jolt rocked the truck. The driver shouted from the front. The vehicle swerved, leaned, and ground to a stop. Elena jumped down and inspected the damage. A sharp rock had snapped the axle. The truck was disabled. They were stranded. Daniel tried to rise, but Elena held him down firmly. "Stay. Your leg will worsen." "What now?" he asked. "We wait for the driver to repair what he can. If he cannot, we continue on foot." Daniel looked toward the horizon, a long, empty stretch of land with no clear promise of rescue. His pulse quickened. The fear he had suppressed since takeoff rose again, but this time he could not hide it. Elena noticed the shakiness in his breathing. "You are not in danger," she said, not as comfort but as a factual statement. "We will get back to the base." She gathered brush and started a small, controlled fire for warmth. As the sun dipped lower, the desert temperature dropped sharply. Daniel sat closer to the flames, rubbing his hands together. His exhaustion was obvious. Elena sat opposite him, elbows on her knees, watching the flickering light. The driver worked quietly near the axle, hammering at metal in the fading daylight. Time passed slowly. Finally, Daniel spoke in a low voice, staring at the ground. "I thought I was dead up there. I kept thinking about my brothers and sister, and how I left them, and how I was going to die before I ever fixed anything." Elena listened without interrupting. She understood the feeling. Losing family without saying goodbye was a pain she lived with every day. "When I saw the gunfire," Daniel continued, "I thought it meant I failed before I even had a chance." "You survived," Elena replied. "That is a chance." He looked up at her. Her expression was calm, but not cold. This was the first time he saw something softer in her face, a quiet recognition of fear she herself understood intimately. Night settled in. The three of them remained near the small fire. Elena made sure Daniel's bandage stayed tight, checking his leg with careful hands. When he shivered, she adjusted his coat. She did it without hesitation, without making the moment emotional. It was simple necessity, but it carried a surprising sense of care. Daniel felt his eyes grow heavy. His last thought before sleep was not about the crash, nor the shouting officers back on the base, but about the strange stability Elena carried, something he had never seen in someone his age. Elena stayed awake longer. She listened for distant engines, for footsteps on sand, for the possibility of a patrol finding them first. Her duty was clear, but something else now influenced her judgment. She did not want anything to happen to him. When the fire burned low, she finally allowed herself to rest, sitting close enough to Daniel to notice that his breathing had eased. They were not yet safe. But neither of them would face what came next alone. And for the first time since Daniel Hart arrived in this desolate corner of Persia, the night felt survivable. Dawn arrived with a sharp drop in temperature. The fire had burned down to pale coals, and the desert looked washed in a cold blue light. Daniel woke first, disoriented for a moment as he tried to remember where he was. His ribs ached, his leg throbbed, and his throat felt dry. When he tried to sit up, the pain in his leg forced him to stop halfway. Elena, already awake and checking the supplies, turned toward him. "You slept," she said plainly. "I didn't mean to," he answered, embarrassed. "It was necessary." Her tone wasn't comforting, but it was steady enough to settle his nerves. She approached and examined his leg again. The swelling had increased, the skin warm around the wound. "It will be harder to walk today," she said, "but we cannot stay here." The unanswered questions from earlier chapters, whether they had enough water, what condition the outpost was in, how close Soviet patrols might be, now took shape. Their supplies were low. Their driver had only partial tools. The axle was worse than expected. If they waited longer, the heat would rise, and they would be exposed with a wounded pilot and no transport. Elena made the decision quickly and without hesitation. "We go on foot. The outpost is 9 kilometers northeast. The driver will stay with the truck and repair what he can. If he succeeds, he will follow." Daniel nodded. He didn't argue, though he knew the walk would be brutal. The pain frightened him, but the idea of slowing Elena down frightened him more. He did not want to be dead weight. They gathered what supplies they could carry, canteens, bandages, a small medical pouch, and began walking. Daniel leaned heavily on a makeshift cane. Elena kept a steady pace, slowing only when his steps faltered. Her breathing remained calm, her posture straight as she surveyed the terrain. She chose paths that curved around the roughest rocks, quietly forming shortcuts to spare him unnecessary strain. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was purposeful, focused. Each step was a deliberate act. After nearly an hour, Daniel had to stop. He lowered himself onto a flat stone, swallowing against waves of pain. "I'm slowing you down," he said through clenched teeth. "You are injured," Elena replied. "Slowness is expected." "That's not the point." Elena crouched beside him. She tightened his bandage once more, her hands firm and sure. "I did not bring you out of that wreck to leave you in the desert," she said. "You walk as far as you can. When you cannot, we rest. That is all." Her tone left no room for self-pity. It was not harsh, just final. Daniel stared at her, seeing the firelight from last night reflected in his memory. She had kept him alive when everything fell apart. She was still doing it now. As they continued walking, a question unspoken in earlier chapters finally surfaced. "Why did they pick you for this?" he asked quietly. "To come get me." She didn't answer right away. The wind brushed sand across the path, and she pushed loose strands of hair behind her ear before speaking. "Because I speak both languages," she said. "Because neither side trusts the other enough to send someone else alone." A few steps later, she added, almost reluctantly, "And because I do not panic, even when others do." Daniel absorbed that. It wasn't arrogance, just truth. She had been calm when officers were shouting, calm when his plane was burning, calm through the night. Her stability was something he was beginning to rely on without fully realizing it. Hours later, they reached a slope overlooking a narrow valley. Elena raised her hand, signaling Daniel to stop. Dust trails rose on the horizon. Shapes moved between the ridges. "A patrol," she said, narrowing her eyes. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Ours or yours?" "Soviet." He felt the same fear from the cockpit return, sharp, immediate. These were the same troops who fired on him. Elena sensed his tension. "They do not know you," she said. "They know their orders." "Let me speak." The patrol approached, 6 men in heavy coats, rifles strapped across their chests. Their expressions hardened when they saw Daniel. One soldier lifted his weapon slightly, but Elena stepped forward quickly, blocking the line of sight with her body. She spoke rapidly in Russian, her voice sharp and precise. The soldiers listened, glancing between Daniel's torn flight suit and the distant wreck barely visible behind the ridges. One of them barked a skeptical reply. Elena stepped closer, her stance unshakable. She held out her identification, pointed to the mountains, explained the miscommunication, the crash, the orders from the base, the fragile state of the alliance. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Elena argued without fear, without hesitation, without a trace of apology. She wasn't protecting just him. She was protecting the last thread holding the cooperation on this base together. Finally, the patrol commander exhaled, stepped back, and lowered his rifle. He issued a short order, and the men relaxed. The commander then approached Daniel, studying him with wary respect before nodding once. It wasn't friendliness, but it was acceptance. "They will escort us," Elena said simply. For Daniel, it felt like the desert had finally shifted in their favor. They followed the patrol to a small Soviet outpost hidden in a rocky depression. A truck and radio tent stood beside a row of sandbags. Soldiers gathered around as Elena gave a report. Her superiors accepted it without argument. Her reputation carried weight here. She secured a transport for them. The outpost radio operator sent a message to the Allied base explaining the situation clearly, filling in the gaps that earlier chapters left unresolved. Daniel had crossed the wrong boundary because of mismatched charts. The Soviets responded according to protocol, and the crash was not an act of aggression. Tension would ease once the message reached both sides. When the truck departed with Daniel and Elena aboard, the mood between them had changed again. The earlier distance, the formality, the suspicion, none of it remained. They sat close because the back of the truck jolted with every bump, but neither pulled away. Daniel rested his head lightly against the wooden wall, exhausted. After a while, he said softly, "You didn't have to fight for me like that." Elena looked at him for a long moment before replying. "I'm tired of seeing people die because others refuse to speak." The truck continued toward the airstrip, the base now closer than ever, yet still burdened with anger and confusion. As they approached, Daniel watched soldiers gather along the perimeter, waiting. Elena tightened her grip on her clipboard, preparing herself to face commanders who were ready to blame someone, anyone. But she also felt something unexpected. She didn't want to let Daniel walk into that alone. She wasn't here only because of orders anymore. The chapter ended with the truck rolling to a stop, dust rising around them. Officers moved in immediately, voices already rising. Daniel braced himself, but Elena placed one hand briefly on his arm, steady, grounding, real. They would face the consequences together. And for the first time since the crash, Daniel believed they might actually come out of this alive, not just physically, but with their names and futures intact. The moment the truck stopped at the airstrip, the tension that had been building since the crash rose like a sharp wave. Officers from both sides converged on the vehicle, their expressions tight, their voices sharp. Some shouted questions, others demanded explanations. A group of American personnel tried to pull Daniel out before the Soviet guards allowed it. Elena stepped off the truck first and placed herself between the two groups, blocking the growing chaos with her presence alone. "Stop," she said firmly. Her voice was steady, not loud, but it cut through the overlapping noise. Daniel saw the effect immediately. Both sides paused long enough for order to take shape. A Soviet captain stepped forward, backing Elena. An American major approached next, recognizing the severity of the situation. Daniel, still exhausted and in pain, braced himself for blame, disciplinary hearings, or accusations of incompetence. But before anyone could turn to him, Elena began speaking with a precision that left no room for doubt. She laid out the facts, the mismatched coordinates, the misinterpreted Soviet notice, the rushed briefing, the radio confusion, the lack of cross-checking. She corrected the gaps left in earlier chapters, details the listeners would have wondered about. Her explanation made it clear that Daniel's flight path had been shaped by a chain of errors, none of them deliberate or malicious. She emphasized that the Soviet anti-aircraft units had followed standard protocol and that Daniel had followed the American map exactly as he was told. The officers argued, but now their words had direction. They were no longer accusing each other blindly. They were assessing responsibility, acknowledging mistakes, and realizing how close they had come to damaging an alliance needed for the Eastern Front. Elena held her ground through every question, refusing to let either side twist the narrative into something political or personal. In the middle of this, Daniel was finally taken to the infirmary. He didn't protest. His leg had gone numb, and his ribs burned with every breath. The medical staff cleaned the wound, stabilized his ribs, and placed him on a cot. For the first time since the crash, he felt warmth that wasn't from a fire or adrenaline. As he lay back, he tried to listen for voices outside, searching for Elena's. He couldn't hear anything, and the silence made his stomach twist with unease. He feared something irrational, that she might be blamed, punished, or sent away. The thought unsettled him more than he expected. After some time, the infirmary curtain opened, and Elena stepped inside. She had dust on her uniform, her eyes slightly reddened from hours of tense discussion, but she carried herself with complete composure. "It is resolved," she said. Daniel let out a long, shaky breath he didn't know he had been holding. "What does that mean?" "It means neither side will accuse the other. The incident will be recorded as an accident caused by incorrect chart transfers and pressure during briefing. You will not be punished." She paused, then added softly, "And neither will I." Daniel swallowed, relief washing through him. The fear of failure that had followed him since childhood finally loosened its grip. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "They would have listened to me a lot less than they listened to you." Elena didn't respond at first. She pulled up a chair and sat beside him. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers interlaced, her posture both tired and steady. "You did not fail," she said. "You were placed in a situation with wrong information. You survived. That is what matters." Daniel studied her. Her voice carried the same calm as before, but now he sensed something deeper, an understanding born from her own history, her own losses, her own moments of helplessness. Days passed. Daniel recovered slowly. He was grounded temporarily, but assigned light duties around the base. Instead of flying, he helped reorganize maps with the communications team, ensuring errors like those on his mission wouldn't happen again. Elena now worked from a newly established joint desk where Soviet and American staff shared charts, radios, and daily flight schedules. Her presence softened the tension. Both sides respected her blunt clarity. Daniel visited the operations hut often under the pretext of checking updates. Each time, he found Elena reviewing transmissions, adjusting routes, or coordinating with Soviet units. She was precise, quiet, and relentless in her work. She rarely smiled, but her eyes no longer carried the cold distance she had shown when he first arrived. During slower hours, they shared brief conversations. He told her about his siblings, how he missed them, how he hoped to return home and be someone they could rely on. She told him small pieces of her past, about her mother's singing, her father's careful handwriting, her brother who always insisted on walking her to school. She shared these details not to gain sympathy, but because Daniel listened without pity or judgment. One evening, during a night shift, Daniel stood beside her at the map table. She traced a new air corridor with a pencil, and he watched the way her hand remained steady even after everything she had endured. "You ever think about going home?" he asked. Elena kept her eyes on the map. "There is no home," she said simply. Then her voice softened. "But there can be a future. After the war." Daniel nodded. "Same for me." The days grew slightly warmer. The base settled into a new rhythm, still strained, still uncertain, but not divided the way it had been before the crash. Then came the moment Daniel had been waiting for and fearing in equal measure. He was cleared to fly again. He received the news in the infirmary where he was finishing his last bandage check. His stomach tightened with a familiar anxiety. The memory of gunfire, smoke, and falling metal flashed through him. But he also felt something new, stability. Not confidence, but groundedness. He found Elena near the communications desk, sorting through messages. "They approved me for the next route test," he said. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "Are you ready?" "I will be," he answered. "If you're on the radio." For the first time, a genuine smile touched her face, small, subtle, but real. "I will be," she said. The next morning, Daniel prepared for flight. His movements were slower, more deliberate. He double-checked every switch, every gauge. He ran through Elena's instructions twice in his mind. When he climbed into the cockpit, the fear was still there, but it didn't paralyze him. Elena stood in the operations hut, headset around her neck, watching his plane taxi into position. The early light outlined her figure through the window. She didn't move until his call sign crackled through the speakers. "Control, this is Hart. Ready for takeoff." Elena put on her headset. "Route confirmed. Conditions clear. Proceed." Her voice was firm, calm, and familiar. It anchored him. The plane lifted off smoothly. Daniel followed her guidance without deviation, the ridgeline far to his right this time, easily identifiable on the corrected charts. Every minute that passed built a new layer of confidence inside him. When he returned and touched down safely, the base exhaled with visible relief. Elena stepped out to meet him as he climbed down from the cockpit. No dramatic gestures, no open displays, but when their eyes met, both knew something had shifted forever. They walked side by side toward the operations hut, the noise of the base fading behind them. War was still around them, uncertain and harsh, but their path, unexpected, fragile, and built through survival, had settled into something steady. For the first time since they met, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a quiet promise.